G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. I want to talk about the subject of terrorism, homegrown terrorism, overseas terrorism, insurgent terrorism, extremist terrorism, religious terrorism, terrorism, the employment of force or the threat of force in order to gain one's political objectives. It's a long story. It goes right the way back to the bombing of Rostock, conducted by the Royal Air Force Bomber Command. Following the bombing of Rostock, Joseph Goebbels, Minister for Propaganda, recognising that Hermann Goering, Reichsmarschall Goering, Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe, and hence the nut jagged fighters of the defences that Germany could put up against night bombers, recognising that they were hopeless, Joseph Goebbels invented a new word, terrorfliegerinnen. The cowards who sit in the sky at the top of the gravity well and pour high explosives and incendiaries onto the hearts of German cities constructed of dried wooden buildings. People who blow up grandmothers and fathers and mothers and children, sisters, aunties. Terrorfliegerinnen, terror flyers. Terrorist, as a word, was first applied in 1946 and 1947 by the British against the Zionists, the Zionist insurgent activists, the guerrilla warriors in the British-mandated state of Palestine. Joseph Goebbels' terrorfliegerinnen had been adopted into the English language, had its serial number filed off, but it was still applied to any military threat which conventional forces are unable to prevent. I forget whether it was Benjamin Netanyahu or Yitzhak Shamir or one of the Israeli prime ministers actually went to jail under the British mandate in Palestine for wearing a dress to smuggle his submachine gun and his hand grenades into the coffee shop that he was bombing. He was a Zionist patriotic freedom fighter. To the Jews, to the British, he was a terrorist. To the Arabs, he was a terrorist. Next time the word terrorist was wheeled out by the British Empire was in Kenya, the Mau Mau Rebellion. In Malaya, communist insurgents were terrorists. In Vietnam, the Americans called the Viet Cong terrorists. In every case, terrorist is a loser's word for a military threat which cannot be answered by conventional means. Yes? That's what terrorism is. And if somebody's conventional military means consists of a captured Humvee, captured weapons with captured ammunition, you'd have to say that the threat of manned or unmanned airstrikes would be a terrorist threat. The idea that you can be sitting in the desert patting yourself on the back for whatever barbarous acts you've been indulging in the process of looting and pillaging the landscape, and then you can be taken out by a missile fired from over the horizon by an antagonist you have no way of retaliating against. That could be considered terrorism to the person on the target end of the violence. Just as somebody who's sitting in a bus in Israel that's blown up by a suicide bomber considers the suicide bomber to be employing terrorism. In all these cases, one individual, for political reasons, for differences of opinion, generally regarding resource sharing, has decided to employ the fear of violence onto their opposition, their enemy. And think about that word, their enemy. The enemy is me. Just like you, just like me. They're just people, justifiably people. When somebody decides that their political imperative is so strong that they are prepared to take up arms and fight to defend their land, their family, their ideology, their way of life, their culture, they decide to become a soldier, a soldier. They stake their soul on the fight that they're taking up. They acknowledge that they're already dead before they start. That's what the oath of allegiance means. And it doesn't matter whether you're a soldier in the British Army or the American Army or the Australian Air Force. If you take pay to polish the death machines in times of peace while praying for war so you can get a chance to see how you behave under fire so that you can test your own humanhood against your expectations of bravery versus your fear of your own cowardice. How is that somehow morally and ethically superior to somebody who's had their land occupied by a succession of overseas soldiers, people who are getting paid to travel halfway around the world and kill strangers because their national honour is said to depend on it? If the locals take up arms to attempt to oust the foreigners from their land, why is that terrorism when they decide they're going to do what George Washington did to the British and sneak up and shoot them from the side while maintaining a camouflage position? Why is it wrong for one person to resort to violence when it is righteous and just for another person to resort to violence? Why is it righteous for all the people in America to pay tax, to give money to the government to spend on Predator drones and Hellfire missiles, to spend on the wages of the human intelligence agents who tell them that a suspected terrorist sympathiser is going to be at a particular house at a particular time on a particular day? And whereas in Vietnam, during Operation Phoenix, if a suspected Viet Cong tax collector was supposed to be at a particular cafe, the village was likely to be obliterated by a B-52 strike. Nowadays, you're likely to get the house next door wiped out by a Hellfire missile gone wrong. Or it'll hit the right house, but the day after the alleged target has left. And that's called collateral damage. Doesn't matter how many innocent people have their heads cut off by the shrapnel of the missile explosion. That's just collateral damage, and that's okay. President Obama makes out a list of people to be targeted for drone strikes, if not every day, at least every week. And that's not considered to be evil. In my opinion, all of these people are completely ignoring the commandment, thou shalt not kill. They are all behaving as if their God-theory is incapable of keeping them safe, and that's why it is incumbent on them to pick up arms, to live in a constant state of paranoid, anxious persecution fantasy, constantly checking everything around them, looking for somebody who they fear wants to do them harm. Why do they assume the world wants to do them harm? Well, generally, if you check into it, it's projection and a fear that somebody might want to get even. Why does America fear the idea that the ISIS or ISIL caliphate in the Middle East is likely to go and bomb America? Well, it's because America's been bombing the ISIS and the caliphate, so therefore they're obviously going to want to do to America what America's been doing to them. It's projection. If the Americans had any Godtheory worth a pinch of shit to the compost heap, they would simply stop supplying spare parts for Humvees and ammunition on the international arms market. And pretty soon, all of the death machines that have been captured by the soldiers of ISIS, the Islamic State of Syria or the Islamic State of Iraq, they'll just run out of spare parts. They'll be back to walking around in circles looking for a donkey to ride up the main street while waving a sword around their head, because they don't make any of this stuff. The idea of arming and supplying the moderates in Kurdistan and Syria, it's insane. 2 blokes were arrested in Brisbane yesterday because they have been fundraising and recruiting to supply fighters for the same Syrian rebel moderate forces who, because they are anti the caliphate, the Australian government is about to send aeroplane loads of humanitarian Russian ammunition by the Royal Australian Air Force Squadron of gun runners. That's when they take time out from supplying the Kurdish PKK, who are the sworn enemies of the NATO government in Turkey. And this is all happening in the same week that the outgoing Director General of the Australian Secret Intelligence Organisation, a fellow called David Irvine, has said, oh, well, by the way, I'm going to retire at the end of the week, and just so that everybody remembers what a great bloke I am and what a wonderful defender of the freedom and the faith I've been in my career, I think I'll just raise Australia's terrorist alert level threat from level 2 to level 3 before I go out of office. And this is based on the idea that 60 Australians have gone to the Middle East to fight in various forces. The 2 who got arrested in Brisbane have been arrested because they've been fundraising and recruiting for the same factions the Royal Australian Air Force is being asked to fly arms drops to. So that makes just no sense at all. The federal police, 180 of which turned up to raid 2 blokes who had 1 crossbow and maybe a gun between them. No mention of whether the firearm was legal, or don't know at this stage whether crossbows are illegal in Queensland. They have been legal up there until recently, is all I can say on that one. But the federal police say that these 2 people who've been arrested for fundraising and supporting a banned terrorist organisation, same one the RAAF are doing arms drops to, they were not in any way planning any operations against Australia. But it builds a climate of fear and paranoia in the popular mindset. And it manages to cloud the media stream to the point where nobody is saying much at all about how 3 months ago Australia did not have any diplomatic relations with the independent Baltic state of Ukraine. Since flight MH17 was shot down, Australia now has opened an embassy in Ukraine after pressurising the Ukrainian government to generate a battlefield over the debris field where the pieces of the aeroplane fell to the ground. So after pressuring for a military campaign over the debris field, we're now going to send Australian uniformed, armed, boots on the ground advisors to assist the Ukrainian government in its war with Russia. Did you hear that right? Tony Abbott, the mad militarist, has decided not only are we going to fight with every Sunni Muslim in the Middle East, because we're going to acquiesce to the American request not only for a squadron of F-18 Super Hornets, they've also asked for commandos from the Special Air Service Regiment to be parachuted in as forward ground air observers, and people calling in the airstrikes on the forces of evil, the wicked caliphate, the people who behead people one at a time with a sheath knife. Yeah, that's just such a terrible threat to the world. One bloke, a pommy running around the Libyan desert with a sheath knife. No, Iraqi desert, Syrian desert with a sheath knife, cutting the heads off American journalists one at a time. It's nuts. And every step along the way, the Australian government seeks the advice of the intelligence and military community, and they're saying to people who have responded to an advertisement that basically says, "Hi, are you a budding paranoid? Do you want to be paid to sit and worry about all the people who might have it in for you and your nation? If so, if you're fundamentally psychiatrically insecure, come along for a job interview. And you'll get interviewed by somebody else who's fundamentally psychiatrically insecure, because they can put up with sitting there imagining threats from every quarter all day long." And you say to these people, "Oh, we're a little bit worried about how much money we might need to spend on the threat of domestic terrorism. So let's feed them another $97 million a year, or $197 million a year." However much the paranoid people say they want, the government are prepared to give them, because it allows them to ramp up the climate of fear in the popular mindset. So it's like pretty soon we're going to have a war with somebody, because we've been gingered up to a peak of aggressiveness. And all the time, Ebola is still growing at 40% more cases every 3 weeks. And what's actually happening on the explosives front in Australia? Well, last weekend down in Sydney, somebody caused an explosion, or an explosion managed to occur in a convenience store, and that killed 3 people and put 1 more in hospital. The one who was in hospital was the bloke who owned the convenience shop. So maybe perhaps that was an inside job for the insurance, and he didn't realise that his bomb was going to be as big as it was, or maybe it was just a corroded gas pipe in a suburban Sydney commercial building. The real biggie, though, was in Queensland on the Mitchell Highway, Charters Towers, Charleville, somewhere like that. There was 50 tonnes, I think it might have even been 54 tonnes of ammonium nitrate, fertiliser, just what all the terrorists like for their bombs. And it was en route for some kind of a farming operation, and the truck went off the road and started to burn. And I think 6 vehicles, as well as 2 fire trucks, plus the B double, plus a road bridge, plus a rail bridge, plus 2.5 kilometres of the Mitchell Highway were blown off the map. Remarkably, 8 people who were inside the blast zone survived. But that was what was the biggest fertiliser bomb in Australia of the last probably 50 years, happened in Queensland last week, and it was nothing to do with terrorists. It was the agro-cultists trying to take too much ammonium nitrate in one truckload and getting the truck wrong. Do we have ASIO looking into who's got how much of that stuff that they might make a mess of? Oh, no. No, we're worried that somebody might get extremified while they get Muslimised in the suburbs of Sydney. Then they might go to Syria, or they might go to Libya, or they might go to Iraq. And when they're over there, they might get militarised, and they might get radicalised. And then when they've had a gutful of living in a war zone, then they might come back here. And when they get back here, then they might talk to some of the young fellas who are in the suburbs thinking they'd like to pretend they're in a Beau Jest movie and go over and fight in the Jihad. 60 have gone over and fought there, 15 of them are dead. 20 have come back here, and the people who want to work for ASIO and play spy versus spy have already got at least 3 people tailing each one of the 20 who've come back here. So if one of them steps out of line, they'll catch him or her. There's no point having a grand hysterical sob fest over the fact that some Australians are going to want to go over there and do that. We certainly don't need to send more Australians over there to come home with post-traumatic stress disorder and blow their friggin' brains out when they're drunk and despondent, because that seems to be what's happening with our military veterans. You know, the Australian Defence Forces who went to Afghanistan have killed twice as many of themselves since they came home as the Taliban killed while they were over there occupying Afghanistan. Why do we need to have more disturbed post-traumatic stress disordered, modern military combat veterans generated constantly by our Prime Minister's mad military adventurism. It's insane. It's just insane. If Tony Abbott had any faith in his God theory, he'd say, oh, well, it's not actually Australia's business to get involved in the Ukraine. If he wants to get really, really involved, he can say, well, that's it. We're not going to trade with either side because it's a silly idea. If he really, really, really wanted to worry about it, he could spend more money tracking people who actually come back and find out what they're doing. But no. For some reason, the people who are running our country, and I reckon it's the paranoid connection, they just don't get the fact that from any rational point of view, every human being perceives the world from their own position. The people who are running around cutting off heads in the caliphate, they think they're on the right side, in the same way that Tony Abbott and Barack Obama thinks they're on the right side. The right side of history, the right side of morals, the right side of ethics. As far as the people in the Middle East are concerned, they're completely, totally sick of being told that all of their resources belong to the Europeans and the Americans and the Asians. They don't like that. It's annoying to them. They think that they have the right to decide who to sell their oil to, at what price, how to run their country. If they want to have amputation as a punishment for thievery, I think it's primitive and barbaric, and I don't know that it's going to work any better than any other system of trying to enforce behavioural compliance has ever worked. There are just as many thieves and robbers and murderers and rapists and arsonists in the civilisations of every culture that exists at the moment on the planet. So there's no great difference in the success rate. But it's their right to live like that if they want to. I don't see why the Americans or the Australians or the English assume that they have the right to tell people in the Middle East how to live. You can disagree with them and you can prove that you're right by living a different way and by being more successful living your different way. You can't go over there and say, oh, peace through superior firepower, when we've got you by the hearts and minds, when we've got you by your balls, your hearts and minds are bound to follow. Look, see, we've got a drone in the sky, therefore you have to do what we say. All that does, it's like a sign in a shop that says, warning, you're under camera surveillance. It just causes a proportion of people to commence surveilling the system to figure out where the camera is and check for blind spots and solve the defences as an intellectual response. If you want somebody to not attack you, you have to stop treating them as an enemy. America keeps treating the third world as an enemy, so the third world is getting increasingly pissed off with having the Americans around. The Americans don't seem to be able to get their head around the fact that the latest plan to arm the Kurds and arm the moderate Syrians has got everything going wrong for it that Vietnamisation had during the 1960s and 70s, because it's the same frigging plan. All you do is teach the gun fanciers how to use their guns, supply them with guns and ammunition, and then when they jump out of the helicopters to go and fight your enemies, they turn around and shoot your helicopter pilots. Who do you think taught the armies of the Caliphate how to use all the weapons that they've captured? It was the Americans and the Australians and the British. Every damn fool country that went in there with military advisors teaching them how to use the modern high-tech stuff. Why did the Iraqi army not repel, not succeed in defending its territory? Well, because the high-grade, actually competent officers were not promoted. The officers, the people who were promoted, bought their way into office. They were the treasured sons of corrupt corporate nabobs. There was no combat capability in the Iraqi army because it was badly led and nobody had any motivation because it was as corrupt as every other puppet regime the Americans have ever established anywhere in the world, including here in Oz. But anyway, as a final parting colophon, what do you think might happen if the planet's reigning solo combat guerrilla insurgent warrior was to catch up with Australia's #1 terrorist tracker? The bloke who gets around in a 4-wheel drive, 4-door sports utility vehicle, painted shiny black, decorated with the logo, Australia's #1 terrorist tracker. Well, what actually happened was Australia's #1 terrorist tracker got to go home with a book of poetry. And the world's champion solo combat guerrilla insurgent got a document case and a couple of notepads as a souvenir. And the joke of the story is that this fella who'd set him up as Australia's #1 terrorist tracker, who was going around giving private enterprise big business consortiums lectures in how to defend themselves against terrorism in Australia, he'd never heard of Prince Leonard of Hutt River Province, the planet's ranking solo combat conventional warrior, the leader of the independent state that declared war against Australia in 1976, had the declaration ratified by the UN Security Council, carried out a leaflet bombing raid over Perth, waited for the whole of the 3rd day, and then declared that under the International Articles of War and the Geneva Convention 1901, 3, 5, 7 and 11, because he'd declared war, because he'd had his declaration ratified, because he'd conducted offensive operations, and at the end of 3 days, no retaliation had been suffered by him under the Articles of War, he had won. And could the Security Council please organise for the repatriation of his son, the Crown Prince, who was being held for ransom by the Australian Federal Police in Western Australia? Australia's #1 terrorist tracker had never heard that story. And he'd certainly never heard of the solo combat guerrilla insurgent who offered the Howard government the prospect of solo combat guerrilla warfare and caused them to surrender within 23 hours and 45 minutes. Who guards the Guardians? I'd say their own illuminated tunnel vision and paranoid feedback loop projected defensive thinking guards us against the Guardians. They just don't get the point that if it's immoral for the individual to take an action, it is equally immoral for the society to take an action. You can't be like the American general who said at the end of a bombing campaign, we had to destroy Hue in order to save Hue. The way to deal with the alleged threat of domestic terrorism is not to glorify and magnify the perception of the threat of domestic terrorism. It's to publicly acknowledge that it's a stupid idea to employ violence for political means, that either all war is an obscenity or all war is acceptable. And while ever you consider that yourself employing violence is acceptable, then you must accept that it's acceptable for everybody else. The way we rid the planet of warfare is for everybody to consider that it's beneath their dignity to employ violence against any other human. If you've got a powerful God theory, sit on your hands and let the arseholes get even with themselves. Watch their lives turn to shit without you having to do anything to besmirch your own cosmic scoreboard. At least that's how life works for me. Judge not thy fellow terrorist, lest thine own heart and soul be weighed in the scales against the feather of truth and found to be wanting. From the Creator's eye point of view, capitalist, communist, Christian, Muslim, Jew, Confucian, Buddhist, Hindu, they all look like industrialists attempting to personally profit as fast as possible by destroying the biosphere of the planet they live on. They're all equally objectionable. They're all working against the prime function of biology, which is the more life occupies a space, the more life can occupy the space. They're all busily engaged in diametrically opposing the idea that each individual should work to make the biomass and the biodiversity increase on the patch of the skin of planet Earth that they are responsible for, and to teach their children how to live in a sustainable fashion that does the same, increases the biomass, increases the biodiversity, makes the topsoil rise up to cover the rocks. The more life that occupies a space, the more life can occupy the space, as each species creates additional niches for yet more species. Broadacre agriculture is the exact opposite of this. It's turned every rainforest that ever got farmed on the planet into a desert. Began 9,700 years ago in Turkey. And after they'd created the desert, the people who had enriched themselves took their jewellery and they ran away. And they bought up somebody else's land or paid warriors to capture it. Violence is not the answer. In the long run, it fails. And making ever stricter laws to prevent Australians from going overseas and learning the error of their ways when they want to get involved in foreign wars for stupid bloody reasons, that's just a waste of time. It's industrious futility and it's counterproductive. It generates the forces it is intended to prevent. It takes a mildly disaffected, pissed off, ethnocentric out-group adolescent in the suburbs, and it glorifies them in their own mind. It makes them more powerful in their own estimation. It makes what they're doing much more meaningful. It gives them the idea that they can go and blow shit up and have a war against the infidel here in Australia because we won't let them go over there where the other jihad is going on. Yeah. Sorry it's a long rant, but Australia's international direction at the moment is just scattergun insane. It's cascading chaotic bullshit that's just getting worse and worse and worse. And yeah, I couldn't restrain myself. I had to say something. I don't believe any humans get up in the morning and say, ha, I'm going to be as bad a person as I know how to be. I believe every human from their own position, from their own lights, judges themselves as a good person who is doing their best. If you don't understand why they're doing it the way they're doing it, maybe ask them rather than judge them from a distance and then try and eliminate them because they remind you of yourself or whatever the hell it is that gives Europeans and Americans the alleged right to impose their worldview at point of violence. They're mad. And they're leading themselves to destruction. There are more important things to worry about than whether somebody had his head cut off with a penknife in Iraq. Literally, there are more important things to worry about. And I guess what with global warming and extreme weather conditions and Ebola and military unrest all over the world, I guess we're in for an interesting population cull. You know, it's in the pipeline. There's not much we can do about it. So pick yourself a good vantage point and watch as the fireworks commence. And the longer you stay uninvolved, the longer you're going to get to be able to watch. If you decide that there's a war on and you just have to run around and shoot somebody or get involved, otherwise, you know, you've missed your opportunity, then you can be, well, you can expect to get turned into compost early in the piece. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.